was thinking of the best way to start this class, and I just thought, and actually, so I tested this. I tested this on my little political philosophy graduate students there at Harvard, and so the radical, and also John Paul II used to say that when you teach philosophy, we have to go back to teaching philosophy, trying to actually ask like big questions, right? Trying to put big questions before ourselves to see how we can answer them. So I think the big question that we can really put before ourselves is whether these last 2 years that we've experienced with Cooties 19 and the color revolution that took place in the last year, if those experiences have shown us the definitive end of modern philosophy, the definitive end of the Enlightenment, and that we are entering into a new age. Going back to the 1950s, so for example, Romano Guardini wrote this book in the 1950s, End of the Modern World. And he said, it's clear, you can see from all the convulsions that are happening, right, that we're kind of at the end of an age and we're beginning a new one. And one of the things that Guardini thought, well, as you're ending an age, you obviously don't know all the elements that will take place in the new age. But if you go back and you study the beginning of the age that you're now ending, you can kind of see how some of the ideas have fleshed themselves out into practices. And then you can also start to try to figure out in some way, well, what might be some things that come next. And so Guardini himself thought it was important to study the beginnings of modernity, the beginnings of modern philosophy, in order to kind of understand what's crumbling. And Guardini says you don't know what's crumbling when it's going to definitively crumble. But as you kind of, I think if you were to summarize maybe a few insights that scholars like to attribute to the modern philosophy of the Enlightenment, I think two that they tend to say are like the big achievements. One is self-government, the politics of self-government. Usually when you read modern philosophers, they have all these crazy ideas about epistemology and the metaphysics are not so good. Morality is crazy, but they do seem to have a kind of, there seems to be a way of understanding self-government that matures throughout modern philosophy. And so self-government, you would say could be maybe one of these contributions of modern philosophy, right? The whole republican government, self-government, the development of republican government. Well, certainly in the last year, that's been swept aside, right? Right? Or certainly there's been serious efforts to do away with it, to replace it with something else. The second thing would be science, right? So often when we read the modern philosophers, they're trying to pit science against faith. We'll get more into this in the course of the semester. But of course, what you have now developing is a complete politicalization of science, right? An ideologicalization of science. And it's not clear, right? It's not clear oftentimes what people are promoting. And oftentimes, we also have, in a way, we have a somewhat of a sophisticated and educated enough population, right, to really ask serious questions, whether those who are giving us science are really giving us science, right? And that's one of the significant challenges of these last 2 years. Now, what I'd like to do, I'd just like to pose that question as kind of a starting point. And what I'd like to do then is I'd like to go through, and this might take a little bit of time, but I think it's worth it, just to to go over various vectors or various larger areas of philosophy that we could look at, or that we'll try to look at throughout when we're kind of looking at each author or each set of authors, right? And I think if we have this a little bit of this bigger image, and some of these trends I'm going to give you, they cut across the strict times of modern philosophy, but I think it'll help us better understand and therefore also be able to evaluate what is the good and what is the bad of modern philosophy? First of all, I'd like to. I think when we consider this, it's kind of hard to know exactly where to start. But I think it's interesting from time to time just to reflect on like what we are doing and why we are doing what we're doing. And what I mean by this is this: why do we even study the history of philosophy in the first place? And that in itself is a kind of it's a pedagogy that's part of what I like to call since the time of St. Thomas, there have been three waves of Thomism. And Etienne Gilson, in several of his writings, Etienne Gilson speaks about, you can see in the history of philosophy, whether you're looking at Islamic philosophy or Jewish philosophy or Christian philosophy or modern philosophy, you can see that there are kind of cycles. And there can be progress that's made in these cycles, but there are cycles. For example, he says, if you go to Islamic philosophy from 700 to 1200 AD, more or less, you start out, there is a kind of idealism. The idealism is represent one idealist, let's say Islamic philosopher, is Al-Farabi. Al-Farabi is he's an earlier Islamic philosopher. He's enamored with Plato. So he writes these commentaries on Plato's Republic, on Plato's laws. He shows how Plato argues for the importance of the divine law and how the divine law is the standard for all human law. And by the way, you can also read all about that in Dignitatis Humanae, point 6 and point 11. The divine law is the standard of the human law. But the first translator of Dignitatis Humanae, who translated it from Latin into English, didn't like the fact that line was in the Latin. So he didn't translate it into English. It was left out of Dignitatis Humanae, this document from the Second Vatican Council. Right? So when John Paul II came to the United States in 1978 and he spoke at the Liberty Bell, he made a point of stating that line in the speech he gave at the Liberty Bell. He said, America's wonderful, it's great, it's a beautiful nation, blah, 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 blah. But he said, but we can't forget that the divine law is the standard of the human law. He's quoting directly from Dignitatis Humanae. So Al-Farabi has this kind of idealism. And then after Al-Farabi, we get Al-Ghazali. Right? And Al-Ghazali, he is raised as an Aristotelian. He's a little Aristotelian. And at some point, though, he gets radicalized. He gets radicalized as a Muslim. And then he writes a book called The Destruction of Philosophy. I have a friend who's a scholar, and he's doing a lot of research trying to show that you can find many similarities between David Hume and Al-Ghazali. Because what does the skeptic do? The skeptic starts to turn philosophy against itself. It uses logic to destroy philosophy. Right? So usually in these cycles of philosophy, you get a kind of, after there's an idealistic time, you get skepticism, and then from there you'll see develop some sort of philosophy of despair. And you see this happen time and again. Right? So what happens, we'll come back to the Islamic situation in a moment, because I want to say something about the three waves of Thomism. So the first wave of Thomism is obviously, by the way, so after this little time of despair, let's deal with this now. After this little time of despair, you get Averroes, right? And Averroes tries to solve the problem of the despair of philosophy, ultimately by saying, well, there's two truths, right? The famous two truths theory of philosophy. On the one hand, you have the truth of the Quran, of Islam. On the other hand, you have the truth of science. And those two things can never agree with each other. They run in parallel, right? So it's a way of resolving the problem by not resolving the problem of the relationship between faith, science, and reason. Yes?
Who is the despair philosopher of this moment?
Yeah, I don't know exactly who that would be. I think in modern philosophy, you can more easily identify those characters in these cycles. So Aquinas, actually, one of the biggest things that Aquinas is dealing with in his own life is the whole thing of the two truths, right? As representative of Sigier de Brabant. Right? Sigier de Brabant is the famous he's called the Latin Averroist, who proposes that, well, there's basically two truths. There's the truth of science and there's the truth of faith. And the two never can really cross paths. And this is one of the things that Aquinas because Aquinas is arguing ultimately for the unity of truth, right? Which we study this all the time when we study faith and reason, when we study a class on Aquinas, when we study Intro to Philosophy, when you study medieval philosophy, you deal with all this stuff. You deal with this. So I'm not going to go into I'm not going to go into that here. But the problem is that the first wave of Thomism is Aquinas, and then but right after Aquinas, you get a kind of rejection of the Thomistic synthesis. And in the light of this rejection of the Thomistic synthesis, you get William of Ockham. Well, you get Duns Scotus, and then you get William of Ockham. We'll say more about these guys if we have to. But William of Ockham is essentially, he's the father of nominalism. And nominalism proposes that the words that we use, there's no relation between the words that we use and nature. Words can't help us understand nature. Words are empty. Okay? So Occam, and it's interesting to study, when you study the history of education, how the ideas of Occam just sweep through the European universities, right? Essentially, and by the way, this book here, it's not translated into English, but this author, Lagarde, he does a great job laying out everything that happens between Occam and Luther, right? This kind of time, this time in history that most people neglect in the history of ideas. But one of the things that he shows, he says, essentially what you see the same cycle. You see the same cycle happening. Occam is the guy who destroys the idealism of the Thomistic synthesis. But but then basically after this, then you get the rise of these. You get by the time you get into the Renaissance, you'll get people like Bruno, and you'll get Montaigne right before Descartes. You'll get Montaigne. These like super skeptics, proto-relativists, and who basically say, well, all there is science. All there is science and making money. The other thing you have in this time, yeah. The other thing you have in this time, and actually you end up getting a kind of similar thing, right? You have this, after you despair, all you have is science. That's like Bruno. The other thing you have in this time is you get the rise of financial interests. No, I mean, just as a way of putting it, right? Because you get the rise of cities. You get in the 14th century, for example, is the rise of Medici Florence, of the great banking families of Florence, the great banking families of the various Italian, and they start financing research in their interests, right? And oftentimes the research in their interests they're basically thinking, well, like, how do I promote science in order to fund armies so that I can beat the Pope's army or prevent the King of France from coming in or beat the Muslims? A lot of the followers of William of Ockham were Franciscans, And a lot of times you can see them writing things like, forget about philosophy, man. We just we want to get the money we can get to develop the right technology so we can beat the Muslims in battle, right? I mean, it's very straightforward, right? So, and then obviously, I think the kind of the big destroyer of eventually you get you get you get nominalism, skepticism, and the financial interests all backing Luther in the Protestant revolt. Right? So it's like these three tendencies. And then out of the Protestant revolt, which is personified by Luther. I mean, Luther was educated by a nominalist. Right? He became very skeptical, wanting to use logic against logic, or logic against philosophy to destroy it. And Hilaire Belloc does a great job in his books on the Reformation. No, just showing how you can actually, and further historians have looked into this, and it's more or less, you can see that every country develops Protestantism to the extent that there's a huge financial segment of the aristocracy that goes along with whatever the reformer you're talking about is, right? So what's the second wave of Thomism? The second wave of Thomism is the glorious Council of Trent, right? And the Council of Trent, where she implements Thomism. So in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, actually the Council of Trent also did a wonderful job infusing the world of art, inspiring a whole century's worth of great art. So it gets where it gets implemented. You also see a kind of a new wave of Thomistic philosophers trying to deal with the problems of the modern world, sometimes making mistakes, but trying to create a new synthesis. Oh, by the way, just going back to this thing of the financial interest, it's also in the 14th and 15th centuries in Italy, you get these saints who are using Thomistic principles to try to basically counsel the bankers on what's the proper way to develop an economy, right? St. Anthony of Florence, St. John of Capistrano, St. Anthony of, there's two St. Anthony's. Well, Padua was not so much, but St. John of Capistrano, St. Anthony of Florence, I'm just blanking on one or two of the names. And then the last one would be Savonarola in the 1490s. These are all Italians. Yeah. Yeah. But there's all these great Italian saints. There's been almost no work done on them in English, on the role that they played in understand and how they understood how the economy was developing, but also what are the moral limits or what are the moral restraints that should be placed on economic practices. It all got swept aside with Savonarola for other reasons, but Savonarola was the famous last one. There are some who argue that if these saints would have been taken seriously after Savonarola, you could have avoided a lot of the abuses that led to Luther, for example. But anyway, so Trent implements Thomism, but it's interesting. Richelieu, for example, in France, he prevented Trent from being implemented in France. So it's really interesting as we go through modern philosophy, and we're in the 18th century. This is the age of Voltaire, Diderot, La Mettrie, kind of the French and what was called the French Enlightenment. During this time, people have gone back and they've seen that during this time, there's almost zero Thomism being taught in French seminaries. Usually, it's like Locke is like the great philosopher Locke. It's like us these days in America. Like, oh, Locke is awesome. Locke is going to save us. If Locke is so moderate, Locke is wonderful. Locke is the philosopher of freedom, right? That's how we get taught from the 1960s to the present, especially in Catholic schools, especially in conservative Catholic schools, right? So, but that's essentially, especially in France, essentially in the 18th century, philosophy in the seminaries, let alone in the public institutions, the public institutions were for the most part controlled by the Scotists, followers of Duns Scotus, and the Occamites. And then even the seminaries were just basically teaching a smattering of philosophy with loving John Locke or Voltaire or Rousseau, and then trying to add on a little bit of, spicy apologetics. No, that was essentially, there was no Thomism in France because Richelieu blocked it. Richelieu blocked the Council of Trent from being implemented in France. And also, it's interesting, it's precisely in France in the 18th century, in art, for example, you start to get the development of naturalism in art, right? Kind of a rejection of art as being trying to somehow get to the essence of things, right? Because how could you? There's no Thomism. There's no essence. And then, so that all blows up in their face in the French Revolution, right? That's one moment where the Enlightenment kind of blows up in everybody's face. And so what happens after the French Revolution in the 1820s or so, basically, you see this kind of at the end of the 18th century, but then also in the beginning of the 19th century, you get the rise of Romanticism. Right, that guy, the fellow who wrote the book, Saint Josemaria, The Last Romantic. Well, what is a romantic? I mean, from the intellectual standpoint. Well, people like Joseph de Maistre is a romantic. I mean, de Maistre is the one who says, after the calamity of the French Revolution, when we're stuck between these two vices, on the one hand of the British system, on the other hand of the kind of the crass brutality of the French Revolution, what are we to do? And de Maistre says, well, I think what we should do is we should realize that there are seeds that were planted long ago that were either snuffed out or were not given a chance to grow. So he says things like that. And what does that do? That inspires. He's not the only one, but there are others who will, I think in this course, for example, Vico is someone who looks into this in a genuinely Christian way, saying, but the point here just being that people like de Maistre, there are others, what they do is they inspire scholars and men of political importance to start to look back into the fathers of the church, the medievals, basically asking the question, is there something that we've missed? Right? So it's like when I was in Estonia, this is an example, you'll see. When I was in Estonia, I met this musician, Taivo, and he's a convert to Catholicism. And so Taivo told us his story, and essentially he was this popular musician in Estonia in the late 1970s, early 1980s. He's walking around his city, and he says, my city is ugly, except for this one street. Right? There's this one street on my city that's beautiful. And he didn't know anything at the time. He was just your standard Estonian of the late 1970s. So he says, so he said to himself, I got to figure out, why is this street beautiful? And so he does all this research, and he discovers that this street is beautiful because it was put together in the 12th century when Estonia was called Mary's Land. And there was a cathedral here, and there was a monastery here, there were art shops here, there was a theater here. And so he converts to Catholicism. And because he was somewhat of a public figure, like 800 people converted with him. And that doubled the size of the Catholic Church in Estonia. Right? But that's an example of a romantic. I mean, that's romanticism of the 19th century, but taking place in the 1970s and 80s. In other words, we can go back, and that's what St. Josemaria did, our father did. I mean, his whole thing of DYA, he took the Colegio Mayor, he took the residential college of the Middle Ages, and tried to think of a way to recreate it in Madrid of the 1930s. It's not like he just kind of came up with some idea out of thin air. So our father, in that sense, was a romantic. In this thing of, well, what from the past has been lost and could be brought forward and maybe reconfigured, so as to be appropriate for the circumstances that we now find ourselves in. So that's the birth of also. So what comes out of this in the 1820s among the Catholics in Europe? there were two groups. There were the naturalists, and then there were the romantics. And by the way, this romantic movement, it produced a lot of converts to Catholicism. They say about a third of the romantics of the 19th century converted to Catholicism. So a lot of them were just people who were just by that time brought up whatever in Europe, and they began to look into history, and they basically said the same thing that Tyvo said, right? The only thing that was beautiful was when this was Catholic, or we got to build a Disney castle. I mean, that kind of stuff. So the romantics, many of them convert to Catholicism, and also you see people in France, in Italy, and in Germany, they start looking back at the last 200 years, and they say, well, we need to study the history, not only of, maybe we made a mistake. Maybe we made a mistake by becoming so enamored with John Locke, right? Maybe those people at the beginning of when John Locke became popular, those people that said, what could possibly go wrong? Maybe they, maybe they shouldn't have, maybe they should have had a little bit of a different attitude, Maybe the guys that started reading Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the middle of the 18th century and said, this is going to be awesome, right? We should all go back and live like animals in the jungle, right? Maybe those guys were, maybe it wasn't so awesome, right? So they began this twofold, and actually what's also interesting, they set up, the romantics of the 1820s and 30s, they set up study circles. And in those study circles, they tried to see if they could mine. They would read documents from the fathers of the church. They would read these medieval documents. Or they would try to find dogmas from the past. And they would basically read these things, and then they would ask themselves, how can we start to implement these things in practice? Right? So, and also they were oftentimes persecuted at the university by the naturalists. So the naturalists, their basic position was the French Revolution, all the philosophy that went into the French Revolution, John Locke, Rousseau, Kant, whatever. Yeah, the French Revolution didn't turn out so great, but we just got to keep going, right? We just got to keep. It's like the people who got the 2 COVID shots, right? And then the third one is being proposed. All the VAERS numbers are skyrocketing. The VAERS numbers are greater than the previous 20 years combined. Girls' brains are disintegrating in Italy after the second COVID shot, and they basically just say, what could possibly go wrong? Let's just keep doing it. We'll just do it better the next time. No, but that was the position of the naturalists at this time. It was the French Revolution. It wasn't that great, but you just got to keep moving on, right? Just keep moving on. It's like the song says, keep moving on. And actually they were very clever. They kind of controlled the universities. So they were very effective, and anybody that became known as a romantic would be blackballed and sidelined at the universities. So a lot of the first studies that developed into what became Thomism, the third wave of Thomism, were done kind of extracurricular, right? They were done out, and eventually, obviously, they get back into the universities. And even by 1840, 1850, they're known as being a recalcitrant, hard-headed minority among Catholic scholars, right? That was kind of what they would be denominated oftentimes. Who became Thomists, right? The ones who started to identify as Thomists. They transitioned from Romanticism to Thomism. That's a healthy transition. No dysphoria there. So, and actually one of their own, ironically, a number of these romantic Thomists become the advisors of Blessed Pius IX. And then this other Thomist becomes Leo the 13th. So that begins the third wave of Thomism in the church, right? And this third wave of Thomism emphasized the history of teaching the history of philosophy for two reasons. Number one would be to try to understand, well, like what are the essential insights in the history of philosophy that we can't give up. And then number two would be, well, especially from Descartes, well, especially from Occam or Duns Scotus or Occam to the present, we should look at those philosophies through the lens of Thomism. So rather than saying, well, Locke is awesome, what could possibly go wrong, and I'll just keep a little bit of whatever I need to of the faith that conforms to Lockeanism, probably a better approach would be to say that, well, maybe we should be a little bit like have a healthy skepticism towards Locke and Lockean philosophy, because he was a bitter anti-Catholic and was a proxy warrior of the oligarchs of England of his time. Right? So maybe we should have a little bit more of a healthy skepticism towards Lockean philosophy. And there could ultimately be good things that come out of it, but they have to be discerned, right? We have to be discerned through the lens of a kind of more full-blooded or a more full-fleshed Thomism. And so you could say this class itself is part of this third wave of Thomism. Yes.
Sorry, this has been bothering me for like maybe a year and a half or so. So like no, I mean this seriously.
Yeah.
So but this third wave of like neo-Thomism and whatever, like came up. I'm not sure. Let's say like 98 years ago, and like
More than that.
right. So
it started in the 1820s, 1830s.
And oftentimes with like I don't know if this analogy works, but like when something has momentum, it's kind of it's on the rise and it's doing great stuff. And I feel like we are pretty removed from like neo-Thomism. Like in fact.
Oh yeah, so the third wave was crushed in the 1960s.
Okay. Thank you.
It was absolutely crushed in the 1960s. Yeah, essentially we're an extremist sleeper cell. No, I mean that's part of the story is that like for example the Americans refused to really seriously take Thomism seriously until the 1920s. And so basically you see from 1920 to 1960 there's like one effort to get it going. And obviously the first time you try to like get something going, there's going to be mistakes. You're going to have people at different levels, different quality of academics. I mean, there's all these other things going on in America at that time: psychological warfare, ethnic cleansing, propaganda, right? Which the Thomists. One of the defects I think of this final wave of Thomism is it was in a way it was a little bit too ahistorical. It was a little bit too like not willing to fully consider the circumstances, and maybe also not fully aware of ironically not fully aware of developments that had taken place in the social sciences and the political science and the science of governing, how advertising works, how propaganda works, how psychological warfare works, how doctrinal warfare works, all these things, right? So a lot of times you'll see, like, so when I came back to this country in 2016, 2016, I was in New York, and there was this question. They were asking this question. And the question was, can a group that's Catholic, can they participate in these UN conferences, even though the conclusions of the conference overall are going to be bad? And so we were kind of discussing this question and studying it. And the whole time I'm saying to myself, well, this debate took place in the 1950s at the foundation of the UN. And nobody involved in this debate in 2017, nobody asked the question, well, because in 1950, they decided, well, yeah, you can participate because Jacques Maritain said, if you participate and you remain part of the group, Well, over time, you'll win the people over to your side, right? And your philosophical foundation will be the one that lasts, right? That was Maritan's argument in 1950 at the foundation of the UN when the same question came up. So we're debating this thing in 2017, and everybody acts like that never happened. Right? So I asked the question at one point. I said, actually, I think there's one thing we need to ask here. Like, how's this working out for you? And they were like, well, what do you mean? I said, well, this is what Maritain proposed in 1950. So between 1950 and 2017, do you think, do you think Maritan's version of the natural law and natural rights has had this like great impact in the United Nations? I mean, you tell me, right? But so the problem is that and again, these are people who are trained Catholics. They're Thomists. Some of them are Thomists. They've been trained in seminaries, but they have no sense that you should even ask what's happened, like that you should know the circumstances. So there's like a defect of the neo-Thomist movement that there was like an unwillingness, or it could be an unwillingness. It could just be because of lack of time. It could be because just life is short. You can only study so many things. But like an inability or an unwillingness to try to understand these things in a little bit more of a holistic sense, ironically, taking into account modern developments, right? That almost being naive about certain modern developments and how the political system works. Oftentimes too, because what they end up doing, again, you can see from within the Catholic world itself, you see from the 1820s to the present, there's always this tendency to revert back to a kind of naturalism. Just saying, well, what everybody else does, that's just like what we just have to do. Without complicating the thing by bringing Thomism into it, right? So I think it's time to go, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So we'll continue. We'll continue.